Fáilte. Welcome to the Village Oak Tree. I'm your host, Terrance Ó Domhnaill. Thank you for joining me once again. I'm back from my long vacation out west, to which, if you're interested in learning about our adventures, read my 4 travel blogs on my Substack page. Now, during my long vacation, I thought some about the future of this show. I decided to redirect the show once again. I want to start focusing on the things that really matter to most folks: poverty, homelessness, tyranny, how the warming climate is making all that worse, and what we can try and do about it. So, come sit you down somewhere comfortable for a bit. And let me talk to you about some of the things I saw during my trip through the rural areas of the western United States. I want to start with a description of what I observed during my travels last month out through rural America. I'll do my best to paint a picture for you of the poverty I saw everywhere across the country and of some of the people I ran into along the way. I don't plan on doing all of this in one podcast, but I want to spread this out over the next few weeks, as I also want to talk about where all this is coming from and the anger and when the anger we're seeing on the streets of the U.S. Contrary to the stories we receive from the mainstream media, the anger we're seeing erupt across the country is not just about the snatching of immigrants off the streets, but a long fomenting anger over the failed economic policies of the U.S. government going back decades. For years, the American people have had to put up with a government that wastes its taxpayer money on forever wars overseas with lies and deceptions. The primary people who benefit from these wars are the rich oligarchs, who have been given multi-million-dollar defense contracts for which the elected politicians get kickbacks from in exchange for support for them. The so-called deep state, as some people like to call it. Meanwhile, these same elected officials in the state and federal Congresses seem to largely ignore the things that their constituents wanted from them when they elected them in the first place. Things like good roads to drive on, bridges that don't fall into the rivers, train tracks that don't cause derailments, and so on. We've all been victims in one way or another to the lack of money being spent on our infrastructure in the U.S. for decades now. Roads so full of potholes that they're no longer safe to drive on at normal speeds. Overpass bridges that look like they're going to drop into the rivers and roads at any minute. A couple have in the last few years, killing and injuring people. Then it takes several years to make the massive repairs that could have been taken care of in the summer if the politicians had spent our tax money when and where it was needed, instead of funding wars and regime changes just so a handful of people could get richer. Dick Cheney, the ex-U.S. vice president under the idiotic George W. Bush, comes to mind. His funneling of tax money to Halliburton was one of many crimes against the American people that was never prosecuted by the corrupt politicians of the time and never will be now. Kind of like how we never prosecuted Robert McNamara and his crew for the war crimes they committed in Southeast Asia. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of all the crimes against humanity that American presidents have committed in the name of combating communism and the spreading of democracy to the world, whether the victims wanted it or not, since the late 19th century. All done with a big stick, to paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt, when he dispatched his new Great White Fleet on a 14-month around-the-world deployment on December 16, 1907, to foster goodwill with a big stick. A fleet which consisted of 16 battleships, a really big stick. This has been the American way ever since. Go around the world and force democracy down people's throats, all in the name of saving them from tyrants. Look how that's worked out over the course of the last 100 years. Americans have never really liked going to war in other countries, save in World War II. That was different because we were attacked first. Although we were actively supporting Britain and China before Pearl Harbor, we were not officially at war with anyone. Does this seem a little familiar? I think it kind of started a trend a little bit. Think about that for a minute. Why did Al-Qaeda attack the U.S. on 9/11? Because the U.S. has been meddling in other people's foreign affairs for decades, creating chaos across the world. Look at what Trump did just last weekend. To what end? The lies are starting to take a toll on Trump with the American people. Why? For money, of course. At least money for the morbidly wealthy, anyway. Remember, the U.S. did not have a permanent individual income tax levy until they passed the 16th Amendment in 1913. Before then, the primary tax levy was paid by the wealthy landowners and corporations. This was originally meant to benefit the taxpayers. But you know what happens when you give a bunch of money to a bunch of spoiled rich kids with little to no oversight? They spend it on themselves, as we've seen through the decades. Whenever the U.S. decided to meddle in other countries' affairs, it's always been at the behest of the morbidly wealthy. Some corporation would have a financial interest somewhere where that country didn't like them, so they would petition the U.S. government via bribes to politicians to interfere on their behalf. That's how the oil industry got its start in the Middle East. The English, then the Americans, made deals with the Arabs in the early decades of the 20th century when oil started to become a serious commodity. The Saudi corporation Aramco was the first of many of these interventions over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century right now in pursuit of oil. Why do you really think Israel is going after all its neighbors? Huge oil and gas deposits off the coast of Lebanon and Gaza. I wrote about this a year ago, back at the start of this war over there in November of 2023. A lot of other people have written about it. And to quote an old proverb from the last century, he who controls the oil controls the world. In Syria, Israel is after the water for their new settlements in their mission to create that biblical greater Israel. But again, it's all about commodities. The more you control, the more power you have. As so many people have pointed out in the media over the last couple of years, Israel is just the attack dog for the West. Most pointedly, the United States. Israel gets control of the oil and gas around and under and around Gaza and now Lebanon, as long as the U.S. and to a lesser degree Western Europe get first dibs on the sale of said oil contracts. Israel gets rich from these fossil fuel corporations. The U.S. gets richer by having exclusive rights to all this fossil fuel, and by extension, Europe gets the leftovers. Iran has a lot of oil reserves and the infrastructure to process it and sell it. The West wants it. That's the bottom line. But the U.S., under pressure from its voters, doesn't want to send any of their own troops to secure Iran's oil systems, like they tried to do in Iraq back in 2003. They would rather expend the IDF to do their dirty work and come in after it's all over and take what's left. That's not working out so good right now. How does all of this affect the average American and by extension, the average Canadian and European citizens? All this chasing after oil is bankrupting countries left and right. We're watching in real time economies implode across the West. Countries like Germany, France, Britain, and a handful of others who's tied their fortunes to the EU and the US are fighting to keep their countries financially afloat. Unfortunately, they're going about this the wrong way. Instead of making fair trade deals, the governments are inventing boogeymen to scare their citizens into giving up more of their hard-earned money to pay for more weapons. Again, the only ones making any money off this are the arms manufacturers. They're laughing all the way to the international banks, where they can dodge having to pay their fair share of taxes. Meanwhile, countries like the U.S. are dealing with an ever-increasing amount of homelessness and food insecurity in more and more communities across the land. I saw a lot of this during my travels recently, and what we read or watch in our news media feeds doesn't tell us anything close to the reality on the ground. I personally observed little towns and villages across America's rural landscapes that are nearly ghost towns, with a few hangers-on living in run-down houses and farms. Saw a lot of empty fields across America's so-called breadbasket that could be used to grow food for people, but are now fallow and growing nothing but weeds. I also saw a bunch of very wealthy estates out in the middle of nowhere, islands in excess in the lands of the poor. The farmers are complaining that they've lost the overseas markets for their agricultural products due to the government's trade policies. But what about turning that land around to feed the hungry at home? Trump doesn't want to pay for that. They'd rather pay for a lackluster military parade and start a trade war with the world at large. He'd rather pay billions to fund his personal war on immigrants by funding his now private army to round up all the farm workers and construction crews to deport them, which will further degrade the U.S. economy without all of this cheap labor. Meanwhile, more and more white native-born Americans who largely voted for him twice are going hungry and homeless more and more every month. Other people I noticed were vacationing like nothing was going on anywhere else in the world. They were out playing with their expensive toys as if the economy weren't teetering on a nice edge. The climate isn't, the climate isn't tipping into a slow collapse, and all is just wonderful with the world as they know it. I guess living life to the max without thinking of the consequences is how these people cope with the end of the world that may be soon upon us. Once the economy collapses soon, they won't be able to afford the payments on those toys anymore, and they'll join the rest of the people in line at the food banks. The cost of this tariff war hasn't fully materialized yet in the U.S., and it's June, but it's starting to show. I went to one of our local pet stores recently to buy a new leash for our dog, and I discovered that there were no longer any Chinese-made products on the shelves. All I could find were German-made retractable leashes, which is good for the Germans, but the prices were $5 or more more than what I paid for a Chinese leash made a few months ago. This is how the tariffs are manifesting themselves in our stores already. Imagine how this is playing out across the country. The mainstream news media isn't talking about this anymore. Apparently, Trump's tariff war is old news. Now, with the fear of American troops going back to the deserts of the Middle East to fight another forever war with Iran. Before that, it was all about Trump's personal military taking down politicians they don't like and the deployment of federalized troops in Los Angeles. Whatever clickbait makes them money on any given day is all that matters now. Who cares about the hungry and homeless Americans everywhere? Who cares about all the infrastructure falling apart everywhere? Don't get me wrong. I drove through a lot of summer road construction crews in some states, but they're trying, but the damage is done. The roads and bridges of the U.S. are almost at a point of unsafe in a lot of states, and they can't keep up due to the lack of money. Even California, supposedly the fourth largest economy in the world, they aren't spending any of that money on the roads and bridges in the rural areas of the state, that's for sure. But they don't tell anyone that. California isn't the only state with money that's not spending as much as they need to bring their infrastructure up to safety standards. All these rough roads only cost the citizens a lot more money they don't have to keep making constant repairs to their vehicles. This adds to the cost for the commercial trucking companies to bring all the food and products Americans need to go about their daily lives. Instead of taking care of their citizens, some states would rather spend their tax money on stupid things like abortion bans and installing Christian-themed wall decorations in their public classrooms. Meanwhile, crime rates in some places are soaring because native-born citizens of all ethnicities are getting desperate for relief, and they're taking out their anger on anyone they can. Just for a fun statistic, this is the comparison of crimes committed by native-born people versus immigrant-reported crimes that I got from Google's AI search. Now, granted, this is here in the United States. Quote, incarceration rates. In 2023, the incarceration rate for native-born Americans was significantly higher, 1,221 per 100,000, compared to legal immigrants, 613 per 100,000, and legal immigrants, 319 per 100,000. This means illegal immigrants were half as likely to be incarcerated, and legal immigrants were 74% less likely than native-born Americans. Note that the American incarceration rate includes those detained for administrative immigration violations, unquote. Now, these stats came from the institutions like the American Immigration Council, migrationpolicy.org, and the Cato Institute. Some of you who have got a pretty good college education probably have heard of these. It's time the American people fully wake up to the fact that a lot of these fat cat politicians, both Democrat and MAGA Republicans, are all on the grift. They're stealing taxpayer money to fund their lavish lifestyles and the rich and famous, giving tax breaks or fat government contracts to their rich campaign donors and leaving everyone else in the dirt. There are a few politicians who are willing to step up and work for their constituents and try to do the right thing, but they're few and far between anymore. Instead, we have idiots like Mike Lee of Utah and the other MAGA Republicans from like-minded states and Democrats living in million-dollar homes in gated communities who would rather steal taxpayer money for their own personal gain and disparage anyone else who can't afford to attend their $100,000 a plate campaign fundraisers. I'll repeat this every week from now on. The only way we the people will ever get back what they stolen from us is to take it from them with a rebellion. Now, I don't mean a violent one like the colonists did to the British back in the 1770s, but a quiet ousting of these greedy politicians who are lining their personal pockets with our hard-earned tax money. We need to vote these idiots out and elect better people to represent us. With our track record of doing that in the U.S., I don't see that happening. We're starting to see some pushback from the voters in some local and state elections, but the greedy Republicans are going all out on voter suppression. If all else fails, one alternative is to divide the country up between the conservative Republican states and the liberal Democrat and independent voter states and let it all go. Then these wannabe white Christian nationalists can do whatever they want, and the rest of us can move on with a better life. It sounds simplistic, but sometimes simple is good. We better make up our minds pretty soon, as the growing climate crisis is going to continue, no matter what our political differences are. Once we move past the point of no return, some would argue we're already there, all the politics in the world won't feed the people once the land becomes unable to grow food anymore. If we think we have a hunger problem now, wait 20 more years, as more and more climate scientists are telling us. The eastern U.S. and Western Europe are experiencing a massive heat dome this week. I can attest to that because it's been the last 3 or 4 days, it's been 100 degrees where I live. Tell me that there's no such thing as global warming caused by greedy politicians and billionaires polluting the planet. If you still believe that global warming is fake news, I have a bridge in West Virginia for sale, cheap. One quick note before I go. There has been more and more discussion in the media about restriction of freedom of speech and the right of peaceful protest in the US, the UK, and EU of late. Mostly about the erosion of these rights lately. I responded to someone's article earlier this week, and someone tried to admonish me a little bit about my mentions of rebellion on Substack. I also received an article this week from one of the founders of Substack talking about the government's attacks on free speech regarding articles in Substack. He cited the example of an Australian Substack writer who was turned away from entering the U.S. recently over, supposedly, his articles about the Columbia College pro-Palestine protests last year. His articles are just one of many recent instances where public discourse about subjects that the U.S. government doesn't like is grounds for refusing entry to the country for non-citizens lately under Trump's authoritarian government. The responder I mentioned a minute ago told me that I need to be careful with what I say on a public forum like this, because the government is using AI to scrub the internet for words they don't like in order to force us to stop. The now infamous Substack writer Ken Klippenstein found this out the hard way and has written about his visits from the FBI in his post the last couple of months. As Stephen Miller continues his attacks on people he doesn't like, I'll continue to fight back here. My answer to this new crackdown on dissent is a middle finger to the Trump government. Let them come after me. I come from a long line of Irish rebels who've been carrying out rebellions against the British for centuries. The U.S. is just an extension of the old British Empire anyway. I will continue to use my words to stand up for the people, defend my right to freedom of speech, and right to peaceful protest at government policies that bring harm to the people, even if I get a visit from the peelers. I just hope that's all I ever have to worry about, is just a little talking to from some government flunky. We all need to stand up or protest against tyranny, no matter how hard it may seem. We can't let them intimidate us, because that's how they win. Sláinte. Now, after my break, I will finally get back to reading more excerpts from Michael Campy's dystopian future novel, The Priest, that kind of got shelved while I was on vacation. Stay tuned, and I'll be right back with chapter 34. I want to take this couple of minutes to explain how you can support me and tell you about my books. First, let me say, I don't like to monetize my work up front, but I'm not adverse to asking for donations through my website or for paid subscriptions to my Substack page if you have the ability to do so. My annual or monthly subscription rates are as low as Substack will allow if that helps. If nothing else, like, follow, restack, or click for a free subscription and share with anyone you wish to add my voice to the many who don't like what's happening to our democracy in the United States. I created this show a couple of years ago, and it's only once a week because I have a little money to spare, and the things I choose to talk about are way important to remain silent. I may not be able to join any street protests, but I can surely protest here. I appreciate everyone who tunes in to watch or listen to my thoughts as I realize that I'm just one voice among the many, but that's how a rebellion gets its start. We start by raising our voices to be heard loud and clear by those who would attempt to take away our rights. Americans do not tolerate kings and authoritarians very well. We had one rebellion to stop a tyrant. We can always start another. Now let me finish up by telling you about this dystopian fiction book I wrote. Better yet, I had this little video to give people an idea of what the story is about. If it sounds interesting, go to any major book retailer to order it, or order it on my website to get a copy of Fugitives in the United States and read it for yourself. The way things are starting to go in the U.S., this story may not be fiction for much longer. I'm trying to write the next book in the series this year called The Camps. Watch this video and decide for yourself if you think this story might become a reality soon.
James had one dream: to save lives. But in a country torn apart by hate and fear, his own life became the ultimate battle. A new government driven by prejudice. A system that left no room for those like him. Immigrant, Muslim and brown skin. Forced to abandon his life and live as a fugitive, he fought to survive in a country that saw him as an enemy. Every step brought new risks and unexpected alliances. But in the darkest moments, love found him. And together, they discovered that even in a state of despair, hope could still bloom. This is the story of one man's fight for freedom, survival, and love.
Welcome back. So what I'm going to do, let me bring up Michael's article here. Hang tight with me for just a minute. All right, we're going to go. All right, there's the article. And I'm going to pull it up on full screen here. And let me read this to you. Again, I'm going to start doing these chapters again now that I'm back to give you an idea of what the future could look like if things all go to hell here. The Priest, formerly known as Bob, part 34. Let's do the time warp again. The thing about being alive now and being alive before the apocalypse is that mere existence is not much different. Before, your life was made up of long stretches of meaningless repetitive days, weeks, months, and years, interspersed with little events that somehow made you forget all the tedium for a bit. Then it was back to the way it was. That's no different now. Our lives are made up of walking, eating, sleeping, and then walking, eating, sleeping over and over. Time just stretches out in front of you, seemingly forever. The change was in the events that occurred. They were more intense and life-threatening. They were more intense and life-threatening now, so the feeling of something happening lasts a little longer, but in the end, it goes back to walking, eating, and sleeping. I had stopped putting all the tedium in my notebook, my content to write tedium again on page after page. I thought about my top 10 list and how I had just stopped recording those, which was a habit of mine from the before times. I would start all sorts of lists of books I read, lists of movies I saw, lists of concerts I had been to, lists of foods that I ate, and about how many glasses of water I drank each day. But every one of those lists got abandoned after a few days, or if I was on a roll, a few weeks. Since this is going to function as a guide for whatever future people might find it, I'm going to get back to it. Number 7 on the list of the top 10 weirdest things about the apocalypse is how fast humans disappeared. Here today, gone tomorrow. I'm not sure where they all went, but I'm sure that a lot of them died. While COVID was still rampaging through the world, another pandemic hit that was a lot worse. People were already weakened and sick by the effects of COVID, and then came bird flu. Since they have been conditioned to mistrust valid sources of information and ignore the obvious, they took a pretty cavalier attitude towards H5N1, and that did not work out well for them. I told my friends after a few years of COVID that since the damage that COVID did to your immune system, cardiovascular system, and brain function, that they could stop exercising and learning things, because all they need to do was become the smartest and strongest person in the room, was not get COVID. I wonder if any of them took my advice. There were all sorts of things to wonder about, things that I might never find out. Like what happened to people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. Did they ever make it to their bunkers? Did they have time to get stocked up? Did they have some weird selection process when they were deciding who to take with them? It would have been a golden opportunity to dump unwanted people by the wayside. What goes in must come out sooner or later, and I don't think they'll like what they find, because while they were all getting soft and fat in their hidey holes, the rest of us were out here getting lean and battle hardened, and we would be more than a little pissed off. What happened to all the movie and TV and music stars? Did Taylor Swift make it? She's some sort of Tina Turner, Mad Max character now? Did any of the action movie stars embrace their action figure persona? Is Matt Damon out there somewhere being Jason Bourne? What about the people who were in action TV shows or were filming as the world collapsed? Did they band together and form their own little club? Were the people that were sitting in Naked and Afraid still out there somewhere and still naked and afraid? Then there was all those Survivor type shows. Where were they? Maybe, and this is another one of those ideas, I'll get a chance to make a documentary film like Where Are They Today? It would actually be pretty easy to do, since I wouldn't need any documentation. I could just show their pictures and say something like, as far as we know, these people are all dead, really sick and dying, or members of some weird cult, and that would just about cover it. It wouldn't be much of a documentary, but there wouldn't be much of an audience anyway. They're not that important, though. What is important, and I'm sure you've been wondering about this as much as I used to wonder about it when I watched apocalyptic movies, and it is, where do you go to the bathroom? The short answer is anywhere you can, and use whatever is at hand to wipe. Disgusting but necessary detail. This is going to be of any use in the future, although I'm sure they'll have figured this out by the time they get around to reading these notes. We have made a decision to start traveling from around midnight to late morning and see what it's like. We're getting higher into the Sierras, and we're guessing it won't be quite as bad. It'll be kind of nice not to have to stumble along in all the dark all the time. But the dreadfuls are still there. We haven't seen them, just signs of them for a while, and we're not sure what they're waiting for. Maybe we're like the settlers that were sent off to the wilderness in advance to see what happened before others came. Maybe we're cannon fodder. That would really suck. Guru Mahagat. Thank you for watching or listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it. You'll return again to help me protest against these would-be tyrants. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this rebel quote. The fire that burns brightest in the rebels is the fire of freedom. Flongo Foyle.